So let's talk about the different parts of the brain and what they do. Parts of the brain are functionalized for different purposes. They do different things, which is why damage to different parts of the brain has different effects. It's why when you look at an fMRI scan or PET scan or something that records neural activity, you could figure out based on the location of the activity what's going on. So, the first thing to realize is I'm talking about the brain, but I'll be more precise and more inclusive if I talked about the brain and parts of the spinal cord. So, you don't need your brain for everything. There are certain activities we do that can happen without the brain, like sucking in newborn or pulling your limb back to withdraw from pain or vomiting. But for everything else we talk about in this course, we'll really be talking about the brain. So, some of the structures of the brain, they are highly relevant and called subcortical, which means they are below the cortex, which means they are in the center of the brain. This includes part of the brain like the medulla, which controls central automatic functional like your heart rate, your blood pressure, swallowing, and so on. It includes the cerebellum, which is involved in body balance and muscular coordination. It contains about 30 billion neurons, so this isn't small potatoes. The hypothalamus, which is involved in feeding and sex and thirst and different appetites. We're going to talk about emotions or visceral desires. We'll return to those parts of the brain. But for the aspects of psychology that are distinctive for us, that make us human, we are mostly focused on the outer layer, the cerebral cortex. So, the cerebral cortex is all crumbled up. If you were to take a brain, put out the cortex and straighten it out, like you're removing a rock you got from the trunk of your car, and you have to straighten it out, it's about 2 feet square. So, it's a lot of crumbling to get it in. It's about 3 mm thick. This is where the action is. This is where, at least for the things I'm interested in, this is where it takes place. This is where reasoning and language and complex perceptions come from. Fish don't have any cerebral cortex. Reptiles and birds have a little bit, but primates, including humans, have a lot. When you look at the cortex, you will see it has two halves. It has a left half and a right half. For each of those halves, when you look at it, you can demarcate the brain, the cortex, into different lobes. There's going from your forehead and swooping to the back. You have the frontal lobe, conversation and oath on the front, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Each of those lobes there's different things which we'll talk about in a bit. Another thing about the cortex though, which is super interesting, is that it includes maps. And what I mean by this, includes topographical maps, where two things that are close together in the brain are similarly close together in the body. So there is a motor area where if you were to shock, parts of the brain, part of the body, would twitch accordingly. Just like you'd expect, the middle finger and is close to the thumb, which is closer to elbow. If it's close in the real world and your body, it's close to the brain, and there's a primary sumatoria area, which is sense organs. So if you had somebody in the operating table and you shocked people, they would experience things. They might experience a sound or a flash of light or a touch. In fact, in the occipital lobe you have a map for vision, and in the temporal lobe you have a map for sound. What's really cool is, I said the map is topographical, but the size of the brain areas don't correspond to the size of his actual body areas, but rather to the extent to which there's motor sensory functions. So, artists have drawn pictures of people if their body was proportioned to the extent that their brain was. You'd see the trunk of the body is relatively small, but their hands are enormous, and their face is enormous because that's a whole lot of sensation. There is much more sensation going on in your hands than in your whole back even though the back is physical apart. So, part of the cortex is there's projection areas, but less than a quarter of the cortex contain protection areas. As I said, the rest is involved with the cool stuff, with language, with reasoning, with moral stuff, and so on. When the questions come in, how do we know this? How do we know what part of the brain what to do, what part of the brain are involved, and why? There's different answers. So, one of the answers is we can scan the brain. We can use MRI, which is highly frequent magnetic field, to look at the activity on the brain. What part are active when people do different things? We can also look at so-called nature experiments, when people have tumors or strokes or motorcycle accidents in damaged part of the brain, and we can ask the question what damage to this which part of the brain correspond to damage to which functions. Through all these different methods were learned about the different part of the brain and what they do, and we could talk about some central specific things that can do wrong due to brain damage or stroke or trauma. So, for instance, there's apraxia. Apraxia is problems of actions. So you're unable to do actions like waving goodbye or picking up before you can bring some food to your mouth. You're not paralyzed. You can make the movements if you have to, but you can't coordinate these basic movements into complex actions. There's agnosia. Agnosia is a disorder of perception, and you're not like you can see but you can't recognize. Some is called physical blindness. People of various forms of agnosia can describe a picture in terms of its part, but can't recognize the object that are being depicted. That's a form of visual agnosia. There is also a specific propagnosia, where you can't recognize his faces. Oliver Snack wrote a wonderful book many years ago called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. This was a series of profiles of people who had surprising neurological disorders, and the title case of the book was a man who actually had such an inability to recognize faces. He couldn't distinguish his wife from his own head. Another form of propagnosia, which some people snuffed from, and to be honest, I got a little bit of some terrible faces, is that you could recognize face as faces, but you can't recognize whose face there are, and it's very hard to you to recognize people. There is problems of sensory neglect. You get disorders that block one of the part of the world. You might have damage to part of the brain, and that would block out the left side of the world. It's not just the sort of physical thing. When you ask somebody with such a disorder to draw a clock, for instance, they'll put all the numbers from 1 to 20 on the right side of the clock. It says if they don't think of the left side of the world again. So maybe it's even a sensory problem, but an attention problem. There is aphasia, which refers to disorder of language. Some form of aphasia are expensive, like a Broca's aphasia, when you can't really speak. A famous case of somebody who can only use the word 10, would say 10, 10, 10, but couldn't say anything else. Or there's something that's called receptive aphasia, where you can't speak, although what you say doesn't make any sense, but also you have a terrible time understanding other people. Then there's all sort of other disorders. There's the disorder which we talked about with regard of Phineas gauge and various form of it. When damage to a brain is debatable whether this is true Phineas gauge, but there are other cases where it's much more clear. Because you, to lose your moral sense, your sense of right and wrong, your ability to control yourself, your restraint yourself, perhaps your consequence. Now, we're going to talk about all other things through the course, but the moral here is that uh, there's some localization of functions. There's some sense in which is responsible to different brain areas. And again, this argument against dualism. We can see that in that anyone who argued that the mind isn't the brain would be hard-pressed to explain why damage to the brain seems to affect some very intimate and very important aspects of ourselves.